My son sat at the reading of the will with a smug smile, convinced that I would get nothing from his mother's $36 million inheritance. But when the lawyer read one single sentence, everything changed. The smile disappeared from Evan's face, and he started screaming so loudly that the walls of the office shook. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor as Mrs. Dempsey's voice rose through the thin apartment. "Wall, your damn sprinklers are flooding my begonias again, Harold." I grabbed a dish towel, kneeling among the ceramic shards. 68 years old and still cleaning up messes that weren't entirely my fault. The automatic sprinkler system I'd installed last month had one loose joint that sent water cascading over the property line every third day. I tried explaining the repair schedule to my neighbor, but patience wasn't Agnes Dempsey's strong suit. The phone rang. I ignored it, focused on sopping up the spreading coffee puddle. The machine would catch it, but the ringing persisted, cutting through Agnes's continued shouting from next door. Something about property values and inconsiderate tenants. On the fifth ring, I stood up, tossing the soaked towel into the sink. Harold Green speaking. "Mr. Green, this is Caroline Pierce from Pierce and Wallace Law Group in Boise." The woman's voice carried the careful, professional tone I learned to recognize over the years. The kind that preceded bad news. "I'm calling regarding Lydia and Green." My hand tightened around the receiver. Nobody had called Lydia by her full name in my presence for 15 years. "What about her, sir?" "I'm very sorry to inform you that Mrs. Green passed away on Tuesday evening. The funeral service is scheduled for this Friday at 2 o'clock at Evergreen Memorial Chapel." The words hit like a physical blow. I sank into the kitchen chair, its familiar creak suddenly too loud in the silence that followed. Tuesday evening. That was 3 days ago. 3 days while I'd been worrying about sprinkler systems and coffee stains. Single quotes, "Mr. Green, are you there?" Yes, I'm here." My voice sounded strange, distant. "How did you get my number?" "Your name was listed in Mrs. Green's personal effects as an emergency contact." "I understand you were previously married." "Previously married. 25 years reduced to a legal footnote." "Yes. We divorced in 2011. The words came automatically. Muscle memory from various forms and applications over the years. "I see. Well, there will be a reading of the will following the service. You're named as a beneficiary, so your presence would be appreciated." Beneficiary. The word felt foreign, impossible. Lydia had built her empire after our divorce, transforming the small consulting business she'd started during our marriage into something I barely recognized from the newspaper articles. What could she possibly have left me? "Mr. Green, will you be attending?" Through the kitchen window, I could see Agnes Dempsey examining her waterlogged petunias, hands on her hips in that stance that meant another confrontation was brewing. But her complaints seemed to come from another world, now muffled and insignificant. "The chapel," I said slowly. "Which one did you say?" "Evergreen Memorial on West Elm Avenue. The service begins at 2, followed by a brief reception. The will reading is scheduled for 4:30 in our offices downtown." I found myself nodding, though she couldn't see me. "I'll be there." After hanging up, I remained in the chair, staring at the phone as if it might ring again and deliver different news. The coffee stains on the floor had already begun to set dark rings that would need scrubbing. But I couldn't move, couldn't process the simple fact that Lydia, vibrant, stubborn, impossible Lydia, was gone. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories I tried so hard to forget. As I sat there, the name Lydia and Green echoed in my mind, each syllable pulling me backward through time until I was standing in Baxter's Diner on a snowy January evening in 1988, watching a woman in a scarlet wool coat argue with the manager about his hiring practices. "You're telling me you won't consider female applicants for weekend manager because women can't handle the pressure?" Her voice carried across the nearly empty restaurant, clear and uncompromising. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week." I'd stopped mid-bite of my apple pie, fork suspended halfway to my mouth. The woman had turned slightly, and I could see her profile: sharp cheekbones, determined jaw, chestnut hair that caught the fluorescent light. She was magnificent in her anger, and I found myself hoping the manager would keep arguing just so I could listen to her, tear his logic apart. "Mom, I didn't mean any offense." "Of course, you didn't mean offense. You just meant to discriminate." She pulled a business card from her purse, sliding it across the counter. When you change your mind about hiring based on qualifications rather than outdated assumptions, call me. The door chimes jingled as she left, and the diner felt smaller somehow. Drained of electricity, I watched through the window as she climbed into a silver Toyota Corolla, noting how she checked her mirrors twice before pulling into traffic. Careful, methodical, but not afraid to fight for what was right. That one's trouble. The manager muttered loud enough for the whole place to hear. I stood up, leaving a $5 bill next to my half-eaten pie. No, I said, surprising myself with my certainty. That one's extraordinary. The business card lay abandoned on the counter. Lydia Grant, business consultant. I memorized the phone number before stepping into the February wind. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call. When I finally did, she answered on the second ring with a brisk, "Lydia Grant Consulting. This is Harold Green. We haven't met, but I saw you at Baxter's Diner on Friday night." A pause. The man with the apple pie who defended my honor to the manager. "You heard that? I was getting my gloves from the car. You left a good tip, too." I could hear the smile in her voice. "So, Harold Green, what can I do for you? Have dinner with me somewhere better than Baxter's." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you asking me on a date? Or do you need business consulting?" "Definitely a date. Though if you have any advice about convincing beautiful women to have dinner with strangers, I could use the consultation." She laughed a real laugh. Not the polite sound women sometimes made when men tried to be charming. Saturday night. Caruso's on Maple Street, 7 o'clock. She wore the same scarlet coat to dinner, but underneath was a black dress that made my pulse race. We talked for 3 hours about everything except business, her childhood in Oregon, my job at the hydroelectric plant, our shared love of old movies and newer books. When she laughed at my story about accidentally flooding my apartment while trying to fix a leaky faucet, I knew I was falling. 6 months later, I proposed in that same diner, sliding a ring across the same counter where she left her business card. "Marry me, Lydia Grant. Make me the luckiest man in Idaho." She said yes before I'd even finished asking. Our wedding day blazed with September sunshine, the kind of perfect weather that makes promises feel possible. Lydia wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers we'd picked that morning. My hand shook as I slipped the ring onto her finger. "Forever," she whispered, and I believed her completely. Evan arrived 2 years later, a squalling, red-faced miracle who transformed our quiet house into something alive with purpose. I remember standing in the hospital room, watching Lydia cradle our son with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else, and thinking that this perfect moment was all I'd ever need. But even then, holding that perfect baby, I noticed how Lydia's eyes occasionally drifted to the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand. And as Evan grew from toddler to schoolboy, I began to notice things I'd missed in those first blissful years. When he turned 7, Lydia bought him a computer. Not a toy, but a real machine worth more than my monthly salary. "He needs to understand technology," she explained, watching him navigate programs I'd never heard of. "The future belongs to kids who think digitally," I suggested, teaching him to fish instead. She laughed, but not kindly. By then, we'd moved to Maple Ridge Drive, a house with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen island bigger than our old apartment. Lydia's consulting firm had landed a contract with a logistics conglomerate, and suddenly, we had money for things I'd never imagined needing. A housekeeper came twice a week. Our refrigerator dispensed ice through the door. Evan's bedroom looked like a miniature tech store. "Isn't this wonderful?" Lydia asked one evening, gesturing toward our new dining room with its glass chandelier and a table that seated 12. "We can finally entertain properly." I missed our old kitchen table scarred from years of Evan's coloring projects and our late-night conversations. This new table reflected light like a mirror, showing every fingerprint. Demanding coasters and placemats, the entertaining started almost immediately. Business associates, potential clients, other successful couples whose conversations revolved around market share and investment strategies. I'd wear my best shirt and try to contribute, but discussions about hedge funds and corporate restructuring left me feeling like I was speaking a foreign language badly. "Harold works at the hydroelectric plant," Lydia would explain when someone asked, and I heard something new in her voice. Not pride, but an apologetic edge, as if my job required justification. Evan thrived in this new world. At 10, he could discuss computer programming with Lydia's tech-savvy clients. At 12, he was critiquing the menu at restaurants I couldn't. A 4 on my own. By 14, he rolled his eyes when I suggested family camping trips, preferring Lydia's business conferences in Seattle and Denver. Dad doesn't understand became his favorite phrase, usually delivered with the exasperated sigh of someone far too sophisticated for ordinary concerns. The first real fight came on Evan's 15th birthday. Lydia had planned a party that looked more like a corporate gala than a celebration for a teenager. Catered food, hired entertainment, a guest list filled with business contacts and their children. I'd wanted something simpler, maybe a barbecue in the backyard with his school friends. This is embarrassing, I told her the night before, watching servers arrange elaborate floral displays. He's 15, not 50. He's growing up in a different world than we did, Harold. She adjusted the centerpiece with the same precision she brought to contract negotiations. These connections matter. These relationships will shape his future. What about just being a kid? She turned to face me fully, and for a moment, I saw something cold in her eyes. Calculation where there used to be warmth. Being just a kid, she said, is a luxury we can't afford to give him. The world is competitive. Either we prepare him to win, or we prepare him to lose. I thought about my own 15th birthday. Fishing with my father, a homemade cake, presents wrapped in Sunday comics. It had been perfect in its simplicity. The party was a success by Lydia's standards. Evan charmed the adults and their children, receiving gifts that spoke of serious money. A new laptop, designer jackets, a mountain bike worth more than some used cars. But I caught him once, standing alone by the pool, looking lost amid all the sophisticated celebration. "You okay, buddy?" I asked. He straightened quickly, slipping back into the persona Lydia had helped him craft. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? But for just a moment, I'd seen the confused little boy underneath all that premature polish, and it broke my heart. That party marked the beginning of the end, though I didn't recognize it then. What followed were 10 years of slow-motion disaster, like watching a landslide from the bottom of the mountain. Inevitable, destructive, impossible to stop. Lydia's business consumed more of her time, more of her attention, more of her soul. Weekend family dinners became conference calls. Vacation plans got canceled for client emergencies. Evan's school events competed with board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she'd say when I complained about another missed baseball game. "This business supports our lifestyle. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I did understand pressure, the kind that came from keeping a power grid running, from making sure thousands of people had light when they flipped their switches. The difference was, my pressure served something larger than myself. By the time Evan graduated high school, he'd become a stranger to me. Lydia had groomed him into her perfect protege, sharp, ambitious, dismissive of anything that didn't advance his prospects. When I suggested he consider trade school along with college applications, he looked at me as though I'd suggested he become a medieval serf. "Dad, that's exactly the kind of thinking that's holding you back," he said, 17 years old and already talking like a corporate strategist. "You settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake." The words hit like physical blows. Settled for mediocrity. As if 25 years of keeping the lights on for our community meant nothing. As if being a steady, present father was somehow shameful. College made everything worse. Evan chose business school, Lydia's alma mater, naturally, and came home for holidays full of theories about market leverage and personal optimization. He looked at our house, our life, our values with barely concealed contempt. "You could do more, Dad," he'd say, as if my contentment were a personal failing. "Mom started with nothing and built an empire. You've had the same job for 20 years. Some things matter more than money," I told him. I'd reply, but he'd already stopped listening. The final explosion came during his senior year. Lydia had been working 100-hour weeks on a massive merger deal. I'd been handling everything at home, grocery shopping, laundry, the mundane tasks that kept life running. When she missed Evan's graduation because of a client crisis, I finally said what had been building for years. "This is enough, Lydia. Family has to come first sometimes." She stood in our kitchen, that crystalline granite shrine to success, still wearing her navy business suit at midnight, checking the mails on her phone. "Don't you dare lecture me about priorities. Everything we have, everything Evan's accomplished, exists because of my work. What about everything we've lost?" "Like what?" She finally looked up from her phone, genuinely puzzled. "Like us. Like being a family instead of a corporation." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw my answer in her eyes before she spoke. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. Maybe it's time we stop pretending this is working, she said quietly. The divorce took 6 months. Lydia's attorneys were efficient, professional, devastating. I got the house on Maple Ridge Drive, our old starter home she kept as a rental property, and enough money to live modestly. She got everything else, including Evan's unquestioned loyalty you're holding him back to. Evan told me during one of our last conversations before he moved to Seattle. The work for Lydia's company, all this guilt about family values and simple living, it's toxic, Dad. I can't be around that negativity anymore. I sat alone in my empty house afterward, surrounded by boxes of memories from a life that apparently meant nothing to the people I loved. Most are now. 15 years later, the afternoon light was fading outside my apartment window. My coffee had grown cold, the ceramic shards still scattered across the floor. Somewhere across town, funeral preparations were underway for the woman who'd once promised me forever, and I had no idea why she remembered my name and her. Well, the 3 days between Caroline Pierce's call and the funeral passed in a strange, suspended state. I cleaned my apartment twice, pressed my one good suit, and rehearsed conversations that would never happen. Each morning I considered not going, but each evening found me still committed to paying my respects, whatever the cost. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, typical May weather in Idaho. I stood before my bathroom mirror, adjusting the tie I hadn't worn in 5 years, wondering what Lydia would think of the man I'd become. The reflection showed someone older than I felt inside. Silver hair where brown used to be. Lines mapping the geography of quiet disappointments. The drive to Evergreen Memorial Chapel took 20 minutes. Through neighborhoods that told the story of Boise's economic divide. Freshly painted homes beside boarded-up rentals. Luxury SUVs idling next to rusted sedans at red lights. My modest apartment complex gave way to middle-class subdivisions. Then to the manicured lawns and stone facades where Lydia's circle lived. The chapel sat on a hill overlooking the town, its Gothic stone spires suggesting permanence and prosperity. Cars lined the circular drive, Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, and a few gleaming Teslas that probably cost more than I'd made in my best year. I parked my 15-year-old Subaru between a Lexus and a Cadillac, feeling like an intruder at someone else's celebration. The chapel's interior whispered money, mahogany pews, stained glass windows, floral arrangements executed with gallery-level precision. At least 200 people filled the space, their conversations forming a low hum of respectful mourning laced with subtle networking. I recognized a few faces from the business dinners Lydia had dragged me to during our marriage, but most were strangers from the world she built after me. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to remain invisible until the service ended, but whispers followed my arrival like ripples across still water. A woman in a sleek black blazer nudged her companion, gesturing subtly in my direction. I caught fragments of conversation. Her ex-husband. Can you believe he showed up? After what he put her through, the stories had taken on their own life over the years. Apparently, in this version, I was the villain who'd held back a brilliant woman, the anchor that nearly dragged her down. I learned long ago not to fight narratives that made other people's lives simpler. Dad, the voice sliced through the chapel's murmurs like a blade. I looked up to see Evan striding down the aisle, his expression a mix of disbelief and barely contained fury. At 37, he'd inherited Lydia's sharp features and commanding presence. His suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. Success radiated from him, the platinum watch, the precise haircut, the practiced posture of a man who'd never questioned his own authority. What are you doing here? His voice carried across the chapel, turning heads and silencing conversations. I stood slowly, meeting his gaze. I came to pay my respects. You lost the right to do that 15 years ago. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and assertive. The kind of scent worn by people who always win. She wouldn't want you here. Maybe not. I said quietly, but I needed to be here. For what? To ease your conscience. To play the grieving widower for people who know exactly what kind of husband you were. The chapel had gone completely silent now. 200 pairs of eyes watching our confrontation like spectators at a championship match. I felt the familiar weight of judgment, the same invisible pressure that had crushed me during those final years of our marriage. But this time, something was different. This time, I had nothing left to lose. I'm not here to cause trouble, Evan, I'll sit in the back. I won't speak to anyone. When the service ends, I'll leave. You'll leave now. His voice rose another notch, drawing murmurs of approval from the crowd. You embarrassed her enough when she was alive. Don't compound it by pretending to grieve her death. I remained standing, holding his stare. Around us, the chapel buzzed with anticipation. Someone coughed. A cell phone vibrated faintly against a wooden pew. Before I could respond, Evan turned toward the gathered mourners, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone used to commanding boardrooms. I apologize for this disruption during what should be a time of remembrance. He gestured toward me with the casual dismissal of someone brushing away an inconvenience. My father seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family. A few people nodded. Someone whispered in agreement. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but forced myself to stay composed. For those who don't know, Evan continued, warming to his theme, this is Harold Green, the man who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant women this state has ever produced. While my mother was building an empire that employed hundreds of people, he was content to punch a time clock and complain about her ambitions. Evan, that's enough. The words came out harder than I intended. Is it? He shot back. Because I think these people deserve to understand why you're really here. He turned back to the crowd, his voice rising like a prosecutor addressing a jury. He took half her assets in the divorce despite contributing nothing to her success. Then he spent 15 years acting like the victim while she built something extraordinary. The audience was fully engaged, now some nodding, others murmuring in sympathy. I spotted familiar faces among them, former neighbors, friends we'd shared dinners with once. None met my eyes. She supported him for years while he refused to grow, refused to take risks, refused to be the partner she deserved. And now that she's gone, he shows up expecting sympathy, expecting to be treated like he mattered. Each word struck like a physical blow, not because they were entirely false, but because they reduced 22 years of marriage to a headline, failure and blame. I thought about defending myself, explaining the complexity of what we'd shared, the love that had survived even as we drifted apart. But what was the point? These people had long ago chosen the story that made sense to them. My mother died building something that will outlast all of us, Evan concluded, his voice thick with conviction. She deserved a husband who would have helped her reach those heights, not one who tried to drag her down to his level. The chapel fell silent. I stood there, fully exposed beneath 100 judgmental stares. Part of me wanted to walk out to escape the quiet humiliation. But another part, the part that had loved Lydia Grant more than anything, refused to be driven away from her final goodbye. Are you finished? I asked quietly. Evan's eyes flashed with surprise. He'd expected me to crumble, to slink away in shame. When I remained standing, his confidence flickered for just a moment. I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. 22 of them as her husband, 18 more as someone who wished her well. Despite everything that went wrong between us, I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because once upon a time, we made promises to each other that mattered, and I choose to honor that memory. I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. Around me, the silence stretched uncomfortably. Evan stood frozen in the aisle, apparently unprepared for resistance to his public trial. The service will begin in 5 minutes. Someone announced from the front of the chapel, the funeral director, most likely, trying to restore order to his carefully orchestrated event. Evan shot me one final look of contempt before striding toward the front pew, reserved for family. As the murmurs resumed, I caught fragments of gossip swirling like dust in sunlight. The nerve of some people, poor Evan, having to deal with this, should have stayed home. But I stayed. Through the eulogy that painted Lydia as a visionary who had overcome every obstacle to achieve greatness, through the readings from business partners who praised her leadership and brilliance, through the musical selections that emphasized triumph over adversity. When it ended, people filed past offering condolences to Evan while deliberately avoiding my eyes. I waited until the chapel had mostly emptied before standing to leave. Mr. Green, a man in an expensive charcoal suit, approached, middle-aged, professional, carrying a leather briefcase. Daniel Pierce, from Pierce and Wallace Law Group. Could I have a word? As the last hymn faded and the funeral director stepped forward with his closing remarks, I felt that familiar weight of exhaustion settle over me like a heavy coat. The ordeal was nearly over. In a few minutes, I could slip out through the side door. drive home to my quiet apartment, and try to forget this entire humiliating experience. Around me, people gathered their belongings, purses, programs. The subtle restlessness that signals the end of a formal event. Evan stood near the front, accepting condolences with the polished ease of someone who had long ago learned how to perform grief in public. A few people glanced my way, but most had already dismissed me as irrelevant to the day's proceedings. I was reaching for my jacket when the voice came again. "Mr. Green." Daniel Pierce approached with measured steps, his tailored suit impeccable despite the long ceremony. Up close, he looked younger than I expected. Maybe 50, with sharp gray eyes behind thin, wire-rimmed glasses and the calm confidence of a man who handled other people's fortunes for a living. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, extending his hand. Daniel Pierce, and Wallace, we spoke briefly after the service. "Thank you." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and unflinching gaze. "The service was very nice," I said. "Lydia would have appreciated it." "Indeed she would," he replied softly, his expression unreadable. "She was quite specific about her final arrangements." Daniel Pierce paused, glancing around the nearly empty chapel. "I wonder if I might have a word with you and Evan. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding Mrs. Green's estate." Before I could respond, Evan appeared at my shoulder, his expression shifting from practiced grief to alert interest. "Dan, finally," he said. "I was wondering when we'd get to the business side of things." "Of course, Evan." Daniel's voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to delivering important news. "These matters require careful attention. I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of your mother's will." "Both of us?" Evan's eyebrows rose. "Is that necessary? I mean, he's not." He gestured vaguely in my direction. "Your father is specifically named in the will, Evan. His presence is required by law." I felt a faint flutter of surprise. Named in the will? That seemed unlikely. Given everything that had passed between Lydia and me, more likely it was some minor formality, perhaps forgiving an old debt, or confirming that I had no claim to her estate. "I don't think that's necessary," I said quietly. "I'm sure it's just a formality. You don't need me there." "I'm afraid I do, Mr. Green," Daniel said, meeting my eyes with professional steadiness. Mrs. Green was very specific about who should be present for the reading. "Both you and your son must attend." Something in his tone told me this wasn't negotiable. Evan looked mildly irritated, but shrugged, the casual gesture of someone who believed the outcome was already secure. "Fine," he said. "Let's get this over with." He turned to me, with that same detached impatience that had once cut deeper than shouting. "Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be." The walk to Daniel's office took us 3 blocks through downtown Boise, past buildings that had watched the city's fortune shift with each boom, and bust to the construction and tech industries. Daniel made polite small talk along the way. The weather, the turnout at the service, carefully neutral observations that revealed nothing about what waited for us. His office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian townhouse. All dark wood, brass fixtures, and the faint scent of polished leather. Framed certificates and law degrees lined the walls, interrupted by photographs of Daniel with local politicians, judges, and business leaders. It was exactly the kind of setting Lydia would have chosen: elegant, reputable, successful without showiness. "Please, have a seat." Daniel gestured toward the leather chairs positioned in front of his mahogany desk. Evan immediately claimed the chair closest to him, leaving me the one slightly to the side, which felt fitting, given my peripheral role in what was surely a foregone conclusion. Daniel settled behind his desk and opened a thick folder, drawing out several neatly tabbed legal documents with the careful precision of a man who had done this countless times. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through tall windows, catching faint dust motes that danced like restless spirits in the still air. "Before we begin," Daniel said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to express my condolences once again. Lydia was not only a valued client, but a friend. Her passing is deeply felt by everyone who knew her." Evan nodded solemnly. I remained silent, uncertain what response was expected from someone whose relationship with the deceased was so layered, so unresolved. Daniel Pierce lifted the top document, several pages bound with a Navy legal backing, and cleared his throat. "This is the last will and testament of Lydia and Green, executed on March 15, 2024, and properly witnessed according to Idaho state law. This will supersedes all previous wills and codicils, only 14 months ago." I wondered what had prompted Lydia to update her will so recently. Had she been ill? Had something happened that made her finally contemplate her own mortality? The will confirms that Mrs. Green was of sound mind and disposing memory when these documents were prepared, and that she was under no undue influence or coercion. Daniel's voice carried that deliberate cadence of legal ritual, steady, practiced, exact. Evan leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlaced, posture taut with barely contained anticipation. A man ready to receive what he believed was rightfully his. Daniel turned to the second page, his reading glasses catching the soft afternoon light as he continued in that smooth, professional rhythm. I hereby make the following specific bequests and advises, he read. To my beloved son, Evan James Green, I leave the family residence, located at 419 Maple Ridge Drive, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Evan's mouth curved into a confident smile, the kind that signaled satisfaction rather than gratitude. The Maple Ridge home was worth at least $800,000, a sprawling property with panoramic views and more space than any one family could possibly need. Additionally, Daniel continued, I bequeath to my son the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate, $500,000 plus. The house. I studied Evan's reaction. His expression barely faltered, but I caught the tiny shift in his eyes. The flicker of calculation. Yes, it was a generous inheritance, but nowhere near the full measure of Lydia's wealth. Where was the rest? Where was the company? That's wonderful. Of course, Evan said finally, his tone trying and failing to conceal uncertainty. But what about Mom's business holdings? The company? Daniel set down the page and adjusted his glasses. I'm continuing with the specific bequests. Evan, please allow me to finish reading the relevant sections. I shifted in my seat, the soft leather creaking beneath me. I felt like an outsider witnessing a scene meant for others, a spectator at the unveiling of someone else's legacy. $500,000 was more than I'd earned in multiple lifetimes. Combined with the house, Evan was being given an inheritance that would ensure comfort and prestige for years to come. It felt fair, natural, even. He was Lydia's son, her chosen successor, the protege she had molded in her image, the one she trusted to carry her empire forward. The bequest to Evan, Daniel continued, includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon his continued employment with Green Consulting Group for a minimum of 2 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Now Evan looked genuinely confused. Conditions? What kind of conditions? And what do you mean until the company is sold? Who would sell it? I'm reading the will as written. Evan, Daniel said evenly. These are your mother's words, not mine. A quiet shift rippled through the room, a kind of alert attention I hadn't noticed before. Evan's confident posture faltered. His hands clenched and unclenched in his lap as he processed what he'd just heard. I found myself leaning forward despite every intention of staying detached from this process. Let me understand this clearly, Evan said, his tone sharpening into something dangerously familiar, the same edge I'd heard back in the chapel. I get the house and the $500,000, but there are strings attached, and you're saying the company might be sold. That doesn't make any sense. Mom would never sell the company. It was her life's work. Daniel removed his glasses and began cleaning them carefully, the kind of deliberate, measured motion that gives a room time to breathe before difficult words arrive. When he replaced them, his gaze moved between Evan and me, and I saw in his expression a restrained unease, as if he were walking us toward something neither of us wanted to face. Your mother's will contains additional provisions, he said softly, that addressed the disposition of her remaining assets, including the company, her investment portfolio, and several other significant holdings. Well, then let's hear them, Evan snapped, impatience seeping through the polished composure. What are these other provisions? I watched the exchange with a growing unease of my own. Something in Daniel's tone, the careful precision of his phrasing, the feigned apology edging his professionalism, reminded me of a doctor preparing to deliver bad news. Before I continue, Daniel said, settling back in his chair, I want to emphasize that these documents represent Mrs. Green's final, considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive discussion and consultation. As she was adamant about their contents, the room went still. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic tick of an antique clock on Daniel's bookshelf. Evan stared at the lawyer, confusion hardening into disbelief, while I found myself wondering why had Lydia insisted I be here for what seemed like a simple formality. Daniel lifted the third page of the will, scanning the text briefly before looking up at both of us. However, he said, his voice carrying a new weight that made my stomach tighten, "There are additional provisions that fundamentally alter the distribution of Mrs. Green's estate." He paused, then slowly raised his reading glasses and looked directly at me. For the first time since we'd entered his office, there was something in his eyes, a blend of professional duty and quiet sympathy that told me whatever came next, I wasn't ready for it. However, Daniel Pierce continued, his voice taking on new gravity. The will also contains provisions for the disposition of Mrs. Green's remaining assets, which constitute the majority of her estate. Evan leaned forward, gripping the armrest of his chair, every muscle tense. Finally, he said sharply, "Let's hear about the company and the rest of her investments." Daniel returned his attention to the document, clearing his throat with the deliberate pause of someone about to deliver life-altering news. "To my former husband, Harold James Green," he read, his voice cutting through the silence like the crack of a gavel, "I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio." The words dropped into the quiet office like stones into still water. I felt my mouth fall open, a reflex I couldn't stop. $33.5 million. The number didn't seem real. It didn't belong to someone like me, a retired maintenance foreman from Boise, sitting in a lawyer's office surrounded by polished wood and corporate grandeur. "There must be some mistake," I managed to say, my voice sounding distant, unreal. "Did you say 33 million? 33.5? Yes," Daniel replied evenly. His tone stayed neutral, but I caught the faintest glint in his eyes, the cautious watchfulness of a man who knew chaos was about to erupt. Evan's face had gone ghost white, then flushed scarlet, as if his blood couldn't decide which way to flow. "What did you just say?" he hissed. Daniel pressed on, reading with the calm determination of someone trained to let the words, not emotion, carry the weight. "Additionally," he continued, "I transferred to Harold Green controlling interest in Green Consulting Group, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and associated business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities, along with appointment as chairman of the board of directors." I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt, as if gravity itself had shifted and left me floating somewhere between disbelief and panic. Controlling interest in Lydia's company, the empire I had watched her build from nothing, the business that had consumed our marriage, the monument to everything she'd achieved and everything I thought I'd lost. She was giving it all to me. This can't be right," I whispered, my voice nearly gone. "There has to be some kind of mistake, an error in the paperwork." "I assure you, Mr. Green," Daniel said quietly, removing his glasses and cleaning them with slow precision, "there is no error. These documents were prepared under Mrs. Green's direct supervision. She reviewed every clause multiple times and confirmed that these were her exact wishes." Evan shot to his feet so violently that his chair rolled backward and slammed against the wall. "This is impossible," he shouted. She couldn't." He turned to me, eyes burning with a mix of disbelief and something darker. Betrayal sharpened into accusation. "What did you do? How did you manipulate her?" "I didn't do anything," I said weakly, still trying to process the impossible truth unraveling around me. The empire my ex-wife had spent her life building now bore my name, and neither of us, not me, not Evan, not even Daniel, could begin to understand why. "I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. The words exploded from Evan like a gunshot. "People don't just give away $33 million to their ex-husbands for no reason. You must have gotten to her somehow, convinced her when she was sick, when she wasn't thinking clearly." "Mr. Green," Daniel Pierce's voice cut cleanly through Evan's rising hysteria, steady and professional, "I can assure you that Mrs. Green was of completely sound mind when she executed these documents. She underwent a full mental competency evaluation, specifically to prevent any future challenge to the will's validity." I sat frozen in my chair, watching the scene as though it were happening to someone else. The numbers Daniel had spoken, $33.5 million, controlling interest in a multi-million-dollar company, belonged to a different reality, one where I wasn't counting grocery coupons or worried about my aging car's transmission, but Why? I asked finally, my voice low, as though the air itself might shatter under the weight of the question. Why would she do this? Daniel gathered the will documents into a tidy stack, aligning the edges with deliberate care before speaking. Mrs. Green left specific instructions regarding that question. Mr. Green, he said, she asked me to share a personal message with you after reading these provisions. Evan's face twisted with outrage, disbelief morphing into fury. A personal message. He spat. She left him a personal message, but cut me out of everything that actually mattered. You received a substantial inheritance, Evan, Daniel said calmly. $500,000 and a valuable property represent more wealth than most people will ever see. Compared to what he's getting, Evan jabbed a trembling finger toward me, his voice breaking under the strain. You're talking about hundreds of millions in total assets. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the kind of tension that hums in the bones, not just the ears. Somewhere in the fog of disbelief, I realized that my life, the quiet, lonely existence I had grown used to, had just been upended in ways I couldn't even begin to grasp. But all I could think about was Lydia, stubborn, relentless, fiercely ambitious Lydia, the woman who had once told me she'd never need me again, and yet, somehow, had left me everything she built. That's when Evan completely lost control. This is fraud, he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. Criminal fraud. She was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised. He spun toward me, his face twisted with disbelief and something darker. You did this to her. There's no other explanation. I shrank back in my chair, stunned by the sheer violence of his words. Evan, I said, forcing my voice to stay calm, I swear to you, I had no contact with your mother. I didn't even know she was sick. Liar. He slammed his palm against Daniel's desk, hard enough to scatter papers across the polished wood. Nobody gives away everything they built to someone who abandoned their family. Someone who couldn't even bother to call when she was dying. She didn't abandon anyone. I said quietly, feeling something steel hard rise inside me. Our marriage ended. That doesn't erase what we were. It means exactly that. Evan's voice cracked, almost breaking into a shout. You walked away from us. You took your settlement and disappeared into your small, pathetic life while she built an empire. Evan spat, and now you expect me to believe she just decided to hand it all over to you. Daniel Pierce's voice sliced through the chaos with crisp authority. Mr. Green, Evan, I understand this is difficult news, but I must insist you control yourself. These are your mother's clearly stated wishes. Executed with full legal authority, Evan spun toward the lawyer, eyes blazing with fury. I want every document examined, he demanded. Every evaluation, every witness statement. I want to see her psychiatric reports, and I want a full record of every single contact this man had with my mother in the last 5 years. There were no contacts, Daniel replied calmly. Mrs. Green made that very clear when she explained her decision. Explained her decision? Evan's laugh came out bitter and hollow. So, she actually explained why she decided to betray her only son and give everything to the man who wrecked her marriage. She left a personal message for your father, Daniel said evenly. The word father seemed to strike Evan like a physical blow. For just a moment, the fury in his face cracked, revealing something raw, a deep, wounded ache that made my chest tighten. But the rage came rushing back, stronger than before. He's not my father, Evan snapped. My father would have been there when she needed him. My father would have supported her dreams instead of trying to drag her down. He turned back to me, eyes gleaming with years of resentment hardened into something cruel. You're nothing but a failed man who couldn't handle being married to someone better than you. Each word hit like a knife, not because it was entirely wrong, but because it carried enough truth to draw blood. I had felt inadequate in those final years. I had struggled with Lydia's success. And yes, I've been the one who couldn't keep pace with the world she was building. Maybe you're right, I said quietly. Maybe I wasn't the husband she deserved, but I never asked for this. I never expected any of it. Expected. Evan's voice shot up an octave. You orchestrated this. Somehow, some way. You got to her when she was vulnerable, when she was sick, or scared, or... That's enough. Daniel's tone cut clean through the room, his composure finally beginning to fray. Mrs. Green was neither sick nor vulnerable when she made these decisions, he said firmly. She was, in fact, more determined and clear-minded than I've ever seen her. Then why? Evan shouted, the word breaking under its own weight. Why would she do this to me? I was everything she wanted me to be. I worked for her company. I lived the life she planned for me. I became the son she could be proud of. The pain in his voice slides through my own shock. For the first time in years, I saw not the executive or the mirror of his mother, but the son beneath it all. A man who had spent his entire life chasing the approval of a woman whose love was always conditional. And now she had given her ultimate validation not to him, but to the man he blamed for every fracture in their family. She left a message explaining her reasoning. Daniel said softly, "Would you like me to read it?" Evan's hands were trembling now, his entire body taut with unspent grief and fury. The air in the office felt electric, heavy with the knowledge that whatever came next would change everything again. A message, Evan said bitterly. She couldn't explain it to my face, but she left him a message. Daniel Pierce adjusted his glasses. The message addresses both of you. Actually, it was meant to be shared after the will reading. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Maybe we should hear what she had to say. Evan's eyes locked onto mine, pure hatred burning behind them. You have no right to make decisions here. You have no right to any of this. But even as he spoke, I saw something flicker beneath the fury, not just anger, but the desperate, aching need to understand, to know why his mother had shattered everything he believed about his place in her world. Daniel was already reaching for another envelope, this one marked personal message in Lydia's familiar handwriting. He raised a hand, commanding silence with the authority of a man who'd spent years managing high stakes. Emotions, enough, both of you. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. Before this goes any further, I have something that will explain everything. He opened the manila envelope bearing Lydia's looping signature across the front, then carefully removed several pages of cream-colored stationery. Lydia knew this moment would be difficult. He said softly, "She asked me to read this personal message after the will was announced." Evan sank back into his chair, the rage momentarily giving way to a kind of desperate anticipation. I sat perfectly still, afraid to hope, yet craving any answer that could make sense of what had just happened. Daniel cleared his throat and began to read Lydia's own words. "My dearest Harold, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Daniel's office, wondering if the world has officially lost its mind. I can picture your face right now. That look you used to get when I rearranged the living room furniture without warning, confused, but trying to be polite about it. Despite everything, the grief, the confusion, the surreal shock of the moment, I felt the corners of my mouth twitch." She remembered that expression perfectly, and somehow, through Daniel's steady voice, Lydia felt alive in the room. Again, sharp, funny, unflinchingly honest. "I know this inheritance comes as a shock. I know you're probably thinking there's been some terrible mistake, that you don't deserve this money or this responsibility. But Harold, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'm going to tell you why." Daniel paused, glancing up at both of us before continuing. "I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights. Not during the divorce proceedings. Not during these 15 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambitions, but I was angrier with myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage." The words hit me like physical blows. I felt tears well, hot and unexpected. Years of guilt and buried emotion boiling to the surface. "You tried to save us, Harold." Daniel continued, reading her words. "You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered, but I was too proud and too afraid to listen." The room blurred through the heat of my tears. All the late nights she'd worked, all the arguments I'd lost, all the times I'd walked away in silence, convinced that she didn't need me anymore. And here she was, 15 years after her death, telling me that maybe, in her own quiet way, she still did. "Evan," the message continued, and I saw my son's head snap up at the sound of his name. "My beautiful, brilliant boy, I know you're furious right now. You're probably convinced your father somehow manipulated me, but sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet." Evan's face went pale, then flushed with color, cycling through disbelief, hurt, and anger to quickly to follow. "You've lived your entire adult life in the shadow of my success." Daniel read, "You've accepted the benefits without ever understanding the responsibility. You've never had to build something from nothing. Never had to make the hard choices that true independence requires. More importantly, you've spent 15 years hating a good man for crimes he never committed." "That's not true," Evan whispered, but his voice trembled, thin and unsteady. Harold taught me about character, Daniel continued, reading her words with quiet reverence. About integrity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or judgment. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over marriage, business over love. But I never forgot the man who taught them to me. By then, tears were streaming freely down my face, unchecked and unashamed. Lydia's words were rebuilding something inside me, something I had believed was gone forever, a sense of worth. That my life, lived simply and honestly, had not been wasted. Evan, Daniel read on. You've received enough to live comfortably and discover who you might become. Without the weight of unlimited wealth, learn to build something yourself. Learn to value people over profit. Learn to forgive your father for the crime of being human and imperfect. Evan made a sound somewhere between a sob, a growl, a wounded noise I couldn't quite name. Rage and grief tangled inside it until the two were indistinguishable. Harold, Daniel continued, his tone softening. You're inheriting more than money. You're inheriting the chance to do what I never did. To use wealth as a tool for good, not as a weapon for proving worth. I trust you because you never wanted this, because I know you'll never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did. The message went on for several more paragraphs, some practical, some tender, her final words carefully balancing business instructions with hopes for the people she loved most. But the heart of it all was unmistakable. Lydia had chosen love over entitlement, character over expectation, wisdom over pride. When Daniel finally finished reading, silence filled the office, heavy and profound. I sat there, tears cooling on my cheeks, overwhelmed by the knowledge that Lydia had loved me until the very end. In her own imperfect, extraordinary way, Evan stared at the floor, motionless, his entire understanding of the world and his mother collapsing in on itself. At last, Daniel folded the letter with deliberate care and placed it back into its envelope. She asked me to give this to you, Mr. Green, he said softly. The original is yours to keep. I reached for the letter with trembling hands, holding what was, in every sense, the last conversation I would ever have with the woman who had defined my life in both joy and pain. The weight of Lydia's words settled over the office like the dust after an explosion, quiet, heavy, and irreversible. For several long moments, none of us spoke. I held her letter against my chest, feeling, through the paper and ink, the living warmth of her final gift. Not just the money, but the restoration of my worth in her eyes. And more importantly, in my own. Evan was the first to break the silence. This isn't over, he said quietly, though the fire had gone out of his voice. I can contest this. Mental incapacity, undue influence, fraud, there are ways to challenge a will. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since we'd entered Daniel's office. What I saw wasn't the confident executive he pretended to be, but a man who'd spent his whole life expecting the world to bend to his will. A man who had never learned that love couldn't be inherited or bought or demanded. It could only be earned. You could try, I said gently, but your mother was right. Evan, you're not ready for this responsibility, and you are. He shot back, a hollow laugh breaking through his disbelief. You're a nobody. Dad, a retired maintenance worker with no business experience, no connections. No idea what it takes to run a company worth hundreds of millions. For a moment, the old Harold, the man who'd spent 22 years feeling smaller than his wife's ambition, wanted to agree with him, but then Lydia's words echoed in my mind. You deserve every penny. Maybe you're right, I said, slowly, rising to my feet. Maybe I don't know how to run a company, but I know something your mother valued even more than business expertise. He frowned. And what's that? I know the difference between serving others and serving myself. Evan's face twisted with a final flash of rage. This is insane. She was sick. She was old. She wasn't thinking clearly. Your mother was 62 years old, Daniel said firmly, stepping in, and she was in perfect mental health when she executed these documents. She underwent extensive psychological evaluations precisely to prevent the kind of challenge you're suggesting. Then why? Evan's voice cracked, fragile, almost boyish. Why would she do this to me? I was everything she wanted me to be. I worked for her. I lived her dream. I became the son she could be proud of. The pain in his voice was like glass breaking in the quiet. Despite everything, the shouting, the accusations, the humiliation, I felt something stir. Inside me died compassion. She didn't do this to you, Evan, I said softly. She did it for you. She gave you a chance to figure out who you are when you're not living in the shadow of her success or her money. I don't want that chance. The words burst from him with the fury of 15 years of expectation and entitlement. I want what's mine. What's rightfully yours, I said quietly. It's $500,000 and a house worth nearly $1 million more. That's more than most people will ever see in their lifetime. What you think you deserve was never really yours to begin with. He stared at me for a long time, and in that look, I saw the realization dawn. Something fundamental had shifted. The man he'd mocked in the chapel that morning, the father he'd dismissed as weak, obsolete, and irrelevant, was gone. The man standing before him no longer needed his approval. You think you've won, Evan said bitterly, snatching his coat with trembling hands. You think this makes you some kind of hero? No, I said, feeling the truth of it in my bones. I think it makes me responsible. He hesitated in the doorway, seeming smaller than when he'd entered. This isn't finished. Yes, it is, I replied gently. It finished the moment your mother made her choice. The only question now is what you'll do with the life she's given you. He left without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed in the stillness. Daniel began organizing the papers on his desk. The rustle of documents grounding us back in the world of contracts and signatures. There'll be paperwork to complete, he said, businesslike again, accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule. The company's management team is excellent. They'll help you transition into your new role. I nodded, still absorbing the weight of everything. Daniel, can I ask you something? Of course. Did she really love me, even after everything that went wrong between us? He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all day. She did, Mr. Green. She talked about you every time we met. Not about the divorce, not about the fights, but about the man who taught her that success without character is just expensive failure. I walked out of that office a different man than the one who had entered it. The afternoon sun felt warmer, the air clearer. I had work to do, responsibilities to shoulder, people to meet, a company to learn, but for the first time in 15 years, I felt ready, and worthy. I realized then that justice had never been about revenge or vindication. It was about recognition, the recognition that character matters more than credentials. That patience outlasts entitlement, and that love, real love, never truly dies. Lydia had seen all of that, and in her final act, she gave me the chance to prove her right. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.